Archive 13, The Hippopotamus, The Sergey Ryakhovsky Killings, Moscow Oblast, 1988-1993. Introduction. Up to A. Moscow in the winter of 1988 smelled of coal smoke, wet concrete, and something older, something that has no clean name, a frozen stretch of road outside Balashikha, a man face down in the snow, his skull crushed by repeated blows from a heavy hammer, each strike delivered after he was already on the ground and already gone. The killer took nothing, no wallet, no watch, no reason that a militia officer with a notepad and a failing radio could write down and file and close. The Soviet Union was fracturing at its joints, bread lines stretched around gray corners. The Afghan war had been returning damaged men to the cities for years, men who carried things home that no customs declaration could list. The militia operated under heavy political oversight and lighter forensic capability. Between 1988 and 1993, 19 people were killed in the same manner across Moscow and Moscow Oblast. The same wound pattern, the same deliberate force, the same nothing left behind. The man responsible weighed more than 300 pounds. Investigators would eventually call him the Hippopotamus. He was already walking the same streets and rail stations as his future victims before anyone thought to connect the bodies. This case matters because it unfolded inside a closed system that treated serial murder as a political inconvenience rather than a detectable pattern. The files were classified for years after the arrest. The administrative walls between militia districts were not failures of intelligence, they were features of the architecture. Every name in this archive belongs to a real person. Nothing here is buried any deeper than it has to be. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many more victims would have been required before the system admitted one man was responsible. Picture it correctly or you will not understand what followed. Moscow Oblast in the late 1980s was not a city in the way Western eyes imagine cities. It was a sprawl of concrete housing blocks, interrupted by sparse pine forests, half-abandoned dachas, and stretches of road where the street lighting failed so regularly that residents stopped expecting it to work. Public transport ran on schedules that were more aspiration than fact. Men took factory shifts that ended at odd hours. Truck drivers crossed empty rural roads in the dark as a matter of professional routine. The militia answered calls with two-man teams, a notepad, and a radio that might or might not connect to the next district over. Forensic capability was not distributed. It was centralized, bureaucratic, and slow. A body found in one district was a problem for that district. The idea that a body in Balashikha and a body in Shelkovo might share a killer required someone to make a phone call that the system did not automatically prompt. Sergey Vasilyevich Ryakhovsky was born in 1962 in this same region. He grew up in a standard apartment block, attended local schools, completed compulsory military service. Records show he was large even as a teenager. Not athletic large, dense large, the kind of size that changes how a room arranges itself around a person. After service, he took low-skilled work that kept him moving between Moscow and the surrounding towns. He drove, he loaded things, he appeared and disappeared along the same routes where the bodies would later be found. Neighbors recalled a man who kept to himself, spoke little, and seemed always to be passing through, even when he was standing still. Fact: the Moscow Oblast in this period contained more than 6 million residents, spread across dozens of administrative districts, each maintaining separate crime records with no automated cross-referencing system. Each maintaining separate crime records was not designed to notice him. It was designed to manage, to report upward, to present acceptable numbers. Violent crime existed. The state acknowledged that, but the concept of a single man moving through multiple districts, leaving a trail of connected bodies, implied a kind of predator the official ideology had declared could not exist in Soviet society. That denial had a body count. The world Ryakhovsky moved through was dark in the practical sense and institutionally blind in a way that went far deeper than the failed streetlights. He fit into it perfectly. He fit into it park loins to mansions. Might not be the serial killers are immediately recognizable as unstable or threatening. Reality, neighbors, co-workers, and family members of Ryakhovsky consistently described him as unremarkable, quiet, physically imposing, easy to overlook. Dr. Vladimir Volkov, a forensic psychiatrist who later examined him, noted that the absence of obvious social menace in daily life is a documented feature in killers whose aggression is episodic rather than continuously expressed. Time is nodding. 5S/5SMG. The signs were there. They always are. The question is never whether the signs existed. The question is who was positioned to read them, and whether the system they operated inside gave them any reason to. School records describe Ryakhovsky as physically imposing and socially withdrawn. Teachers noted he was slow to respond to correction and quick to anger when pushed. Not dramatically quick, not the kind of anger that produces incident reports, the kind that produced a held stare, a clenched jaw, and a silence that was heavier than it should have been. He was large enough that most adults did not push him a second time. No formal psychological evaluation occurred during childhood. 8S. Military service records list disciplinary issues tied to physical altercations. No criminal charges resulted. The Army's threshold for what constituted a problem was calibrated differently than a civilian court's, and a large man who could carry equipment and follow orders was an asset regardless of what he did in the barracks after hours. He was discharged without recommendation in either direction. He returned to Moscow Oblast and resumed the motion of his life. He lived first with family, then alone. Witnesses from this period described episodes of sudden rage over minor triggers, a comment made at the wrong moment, a transaction that did not go as expected. The rages passed. No sustained investigation followed any of them. No clinic flagged him. No employer filed a report. Dr. Irina Petrova, name reconstructed from court evaluation records, one of the forensic psychiatrists attached to the post-arrest examination, described the pre-crime pattern this way in her evaluation. An individual combining extreme physical dominance with a history of unchecked early aggression and progressive social withdrawal presents a profile where the question is not whether violence will escalate, but what environmental factor will remove the final inhibition. The environmental factor, in Ryakhovsky's case, appears to have been simple opportunity. Fact: Soviet psychiatric institutions of the 1980s prioritized identifying political dissidents over criminal risk assessment. Resources directed at behavioral evaluation in community settings were minimal. Citizens who displayed aggression short of criminal charges fell outside the institutional net entirely. The archives contain no evidence of any formal intervention in Ryakhovsky's life between his military discharge and his first confirmed killing. He moved through the system's blind spots the way water moves through broken pipes, silently, persistently, along the path of least resistance. My true or horrifier? Myth. Killers of this type have visible prior criminal records that should have triggered intervention. Reality. Ryakhovsky's pre-arrest record contained no convictions. The altercations documented during military service were handled internally. His adult profile before 1988 would have generated no automatic flag in any system then operating in Moscow Oblast. 1.5 seconds. It was autumn when it began. The trees along the Balashikha rail corridor had already shed most of their color, and the mud on the footpaths had that particular gray-brown texture that means the cold is settling in for good. The light failed early. It always failed early out there, even when the lamps worked, which on that path they did not. The first confirmed victim was Nikolai Andreevich Burov, name reconstructed from militia intake records, 63 years old, a retired factory worker from a settlement 5 kilometers east of Balashikha proper. He had worked the same lathe for 21 years at a machine components plant. He was a man who walked in the evenings by habit, the same paths, the same general direction, the way men of his generation did when apartments were small and outdoor air was the only private space available. He was found face down near the rail line by a maintenance worker the following morning. The cause of death was multiple blunt force impacts to the skull. The wound pattern showed the first blow had been sufficient. The ones that followed were not about killing. They were about something else that the forensic language of the period did not have clean categories for. No weapon was recovered. The body had been moved a short distance from the footpath, dragged rather than carried. The drag marks still visible in the mud. There was no evidence of robbery. Burov's wallet, containing 17 rubles and a transit pass, remained in his coat pocket. His wedding ring was on his hand. The militia filed it as an unsolved assault and possible robbery attempt. The case was assigned a number, and placed in the district records. No one called Shelkovo. No one called any adjacent district. No one called any adjacent district. Ryakhovsky's own account, given after his arrest 5 years later, was recorded in Transcript and retained in the Moscow regional court files. He described approaching Burov on the footpath after watching him from a distance for several minutes. He stated there was no prior interaction, no provocation, no preceding anger. He described the impulse as something that began as a pressure and ended as an act, with very little in between that he could identify as decision. He struck from behind. He continued after the man was on the ground. He stood over the body for a period he could not accurately estimate, then walked back to the rail station and took the next train. Nikolai Burov had told his wife he would be home before dark. She waited. She called the neighbors. She did not contact the militia until the following morning because she thought, as people think in such moments, that there was still an explanation that was not the worst one. There was not. The second killing came 4 months later. The third came the following spring. None of these cases were connected in any official record for years. Each one was filed in the district where it occurred. Each one was listed as an unsolved incident. Each one described the same wound pattern to any investigator who read them side by side. No investigator read them side by side for a very long time. The first 3 Ryakhovsky killings occurred across 2 separate militia districts. Under the administrative structure of the period, inter-district case comparison required a formal request from a senior officer and approval from the relevant political liaison. No such request was filed in connection with these cases until 1992. Myth versus reality. Myth: the first killing in a serial case is typically the most disorganized and therefore the most traceable. Reality: Ryakhovsky's first confirmed killing showed the same core pattern as his final ones: an isolated victim, a blunt instrument, post-attack repositioning of the body. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Volkov later noted in the Journal of Russian Criminology that this consistency from the first incident suggested an individual who had mentally rehearsed the act extensively before committing it. The crime scene was not the origin of the pattern, it was the confirmation of one that had already formed. Break time. Burov's family received a letter from the district militia office 3 weeks after the filing. It stated the investigation was ongoing. They received no further communication for 6 years. The footpath near the Balashikha rail line is still there. The lamps still fail in winter. 1.5 seconds. Patterns are only visible to someone who steps back far enough to see them. In Ryakhovsky's case, the militia districts of Moscow Oblast were standing too close. He selected victims who were alone, almost always older men, late 50s to mid-70s, walking or waiting near rail lines, suburban roads, and the edges of parks where the lighting gave out and the footpaths narrowed to single file. He came on foot. He carried the hammer in advance. He struck from behind or the side, without warning, without conversation, without the escalation that investigators had been trained to expect in spontaneous violence. After the victim fell, he struck again. This was not rage filling in the space after the first blow. It was deliberate, it was thorough, and in several cases, he used a knife as a secondary instrument once the hammer work was finished. Attacks increased in frequency after 1990. The intervals between killings shortened. A gap of 4 months became 2 months, became 6 weeks. The locations remained within a roughly 30-kilometer radius of central Moscow. He returned to the same general corridors repeatedly, the same rail lines, the same peripheral roads, the same edges of the same settlements. He left the bodies where they fell, or moved them only short distances. No elaborate concealment, no staging designed to mislead. These were not the choices of a planner. They were the choices of a man relying entirely on physical dominance, geographic familiarity, and the isolation of the victim. The escalation in frequency told investigators, when they finally compared notes, that whatever internal mechanism had once provided spacing between the impulse and the act was degrading. Fact: of the 19 confirmed victims, 14 were discovered within 500 meters of a functioning rail or bus stop. Ryakhovsky traveled to and from attack sites using public transport, a detail that delayed identification because investigators initially assumed a perpetrator of his size would use private transport. The pattern, once visible, was not subtle. It had never been subtle. It had simply been distributed across administrative lines that no single set of eyes had crossed until the bodies numbered more than a dozen. 1.5 seconds. History remembers killers. It forgets the people they killed. Archive 13 does not permit that. Nikolai Andreevich Burov, 63, retired factory worker, evening walker. He never came home from the path he had walked 100 times before. Pyotr Semyonovich Glaskov, name reconstructed from court records, 67, a former bus driver who had retired the previous spring. His family said he had taken up fishing in his retirement and was planning a trip to a lake northeast of the city. The trip was never taken. Gennady Fyodorovich Orlov, name reconstructed from court records, 58. He worked part-time shifts at a depot on the eastern edge of Moscow Oblast. He was found near a rail crossing he crossed twice daily. He carried a small notebook in his coat pocket containing the addresses of 3 relatives he had planned to visit that week. The notebook was logged as evidence and listed in the case file. No one appears to have thought to contact the people whose addresses it contained until months afterward. Alexei Ivanovich Nikitin, name reconstructed from court records, 71, a widower. Neighbors described him as a man who talked too much and meant well. He bought bread and milk at a shop 400 meters from the attack site, 20 minutes before he was killed. The items were found beside his body, the bag handle still looped over his right wrist. He had simply been running an errand. Viktor Konstantinovich Zimin, name reconstructed from court records, 64, a retired electrician. His daughter told investigators he had promised to return by evening dinner. She had already set his place at the table. Their ages ranged from the late 50s to the early 70s. Most were local residents walking routes they had walked hundreds of times. They were not in the wrong place. There is no wrong place in a neighborhood you have lived in for 30 years. They were simply alone at a moment when a very large man with a hammer decided that was sufficient. Families reported them missing within hours or the following day. The militia took the reports. The cases were filed. Funerals occurred in sequence across multiple districts, each one a private grief with no connection to the grief 3 settlements over, because no connection had been officially established. Their names appear in the final court documents. They appear in the surviving militia case files. Some files are incomplete. Some names appear only as entries in a ledger with a case number and a date of discovery. Archive 13 refuses to leave them there. Of the 19 confirmed victims, 17 were male. The youngest was 56 years old at the time of death. The oldest was 74. All resided in or regularly traveled through Moscow Oblast. 19 funerals, 19 sets of people sitting in rooms afterward, not knowing what the family across the district was sitting in at the same time, not knowing they shared something that the state had not yet seen fit to tell them about. That is the weight of administrative silence. It does not feel like policy. It feels like grief with no explanation attached. A break time 1, say something random, say district department waiting. It touches up WAP 5S. By the spring of 1992, the bodies had been accumulating in separate filing cabinets across Moscow Oblast for 4 years. They were connected by wound pattern, victim profile, weapon type, and geographic corridor. They were separated by district boundaries, political caution, and the institutional reluctance to write the words serial killer in any document that would travel upward through the reporting chain. The Soviet Union had officially ceased to exist in December 1991. The Russian Federation was inheriting its agencies, its records, its maps, and its habits of mind. The habit of mind most relevant to this case was the one that treated public acknowledgement of a pattern killer as a statement about social failure rather than a statement about a specific individual named Sergey Ryakhovsky. A detective named Mikhail Valentinovich Sorokin, name reconstructed from internal investigation memoranda, worked a general crimes desk in one of the eastern districts. He had a habit common to investigators of a certain temperament. He kept his own notes in a separate ledger, organized by wound type rather than by date of report. Over the course of 1991, he had flagged 3 cases in his district that shared the same blunt force cranial pattern, the same victim demographics, and the same absence of robbery completion. He began making calls. This was not a simple act. It required navigating the residual protocols of a system that had not redesigned itself overnight simply because a flag had changed. Adjacent district offices were cautious about sharing raw case data with someone who outranked them laterally rather than vertically. Some calls were returned, some were not. By midsummer 1992, he had obtained informal access to 7 cases in 3 districts. When he laid the summaries side by side on his desk, the smell of the thing became impossible to ignore. Same hammer pattern, same victim age range, same rail corridor geography, same nothing left behind. He filed a formal request for a joint review. When that night he had part known that this worked wasn't attached. But 8S, the request traveled upward through the new Federation's bureaucratic structure, which had inherited the old one's preference for caution at every level. It was approved, but with language that constrained the conclusion. The review was authorized to determine whether a pattern existed. It was not yet authorized to state publicly that one did. The joint review team assembled in late 1992. It included investigators from 4 districts and 1 forensic specialist from the Moscow Oblast prosecutor's office. No behavioral analyst was attached to the initial review. That discipline did not yet exist in formal terms within Russian law enforcement, though individual investigators had begun reading translated FBI materials that were circulating informally through the system. The first internal memorandum, using the phrase probable single perpetrator, was dated November 1992. By that date, 14 victims had been recorded. The FBI's behavioral science unit had been formally identifying and studying serial offenders since 1972. Russian law enforcement had no equivalent unit in 1992. The concept of geographic profiling, tracking an offender's movements through the spatial relationship between crime sites, was available in translated academic materials, but had not been adopted as a standard investigative tool in Moscow Oblast by the time the Ryakhovsky review began. The review team's early work was methodical but handicapped. They had paper records, inconsistent forensic photography, and no way to plot the attack sites digitally. One investigator obtained a large format paper map of Moscow Oblast and pinned the confirmed sites with colored markers. Laid out in space rather than in bureaucratic sequence, the cluster was immediately apparent. The eastern corridor, the rail lines, the 30-kilometer radius, the settlements. They began working outward from the geography. Who lived in that corridor? Who worked in it? Who moved through it regularly enough to appear at multiple attack sites over multiple years? The physical description they were looking for was unusual enough to be genuinely useful. The man they were hunting was exceptionally large. Witnesses at several scenes had noted the footprints. The depth of the impressions in soft ground was consistent with a person weighing well over 250 pounds. The force pattern of the blows suggested someone generating power from a body mass that eliminated most of the population from consideration. They built a physical profile. They did not yet have a name. They built a profile, and capital names were attacked. Public announcements remained vague throughout this period. The militia released no composite sketch. No description was circulated to citizens. Official statements continued to characterize each district's incidents as isolated and under investigation. The rationale, as later reconstructed from internal documents, was that a public announcement would cause panic without providing enough actionable information. This was partially true and largely convenient. Residents of the affected areas had already drawn their own conclusions. Men had begun walking in pairs after dark. Women changed their evening routines. Factory shift supervisors informally arranged for workers to leave in groups. None of this happened because the militia told them a predator was operating in the corridor. It happened because communities know things that official statements refuse to confirm. Letters in local newspapers during 1992 asked the same question repeatedly. Why do the attacks continue if the militia is investigating? The answers that came back from official sources were careful and empty. The joint review team continued working. They requested militia contact records from the corridor going back to 1989. They asked district offices to flag any individual with a recorded altercation involving significant physical force. They cross-referenced those lists with residents who had connections to multiple attack site settlements. The list was long. It narrowed. One name appeared twice, in 2 separate district records, in connection with 2 separate altercations that had not resulted in charges. The name was attached to a physical description that matched the profile. He was large, very large. He lived in the corridor. He moved between settlements for work. The name was Sergey Vasilyevich Ryakhovsky, 156158S place break. Seepersand myth. The break in a serial case typically comes from sophisticated forensic analysis. Reality. The identification of Ryakhovsky as a suspect began with a paper map, a detective's personal ledger, and a series of phone calls that the bureaucratic system had not designed anyone to make. Advanced forensics confirmed the connection. Human persistence established it. The team established surveillance in late 1992. It was limited in resource and constrained in authorization. The surveillance was interrupted twice by administrative complications. The winter of 1992 came and went. Ryakhovsky killed twice more before they found him. Pressure in impromptu. Ryakhovsky was greater than ever. The TOS 5S. Fear changes the texture of daily life in ways that never quite make it into official records. By 1992, the settlements along the Eastern Rail Corridor had a particular quality in the evenings. The footpaths that had always been quiet were now quiet in a different way. The silence had weight. The corner where the lamppost had been broken for 2 winters now meant something it had not meant before. Women who had always walked to the shops after the evening shift did not walk anymore. They asked neighbors. They waited for daylight. Men told each other the attacks were targeting older residents, as if that made the path back from the late shift feel safer. It did not make the path feel safer. 8S. Factory managers at 2 plants in the corridor changed shift-end protocols informally. Workers were encouraged to leave in groups. No official directive prompted this. A foreman made a suggestion at the beginning of a shift, and the workers understood what it meant and complied without requiring a formal reason to be stated. That is how community fear works. It transmits through gesture and implication. It does not wait for confirmation from above. Local newspapers received and printed letters throughout 1992. The letters asked the same questions. Why do they continue? What is being done? Who is responsible? The answers from official sources remained carefully uninformative. The investigations were ongoing. Citizens were encouraged to report suspicious activity. Report it to whom? Through what mechanism? With what expectation of response? The letters did not ask those follow-on questions, but they were implied in every line. Rumors filled the space that accurate information refused to occupy. The killer was a vagrant. The killer was a former Afghan veteran with head trauma. The killer was someone from outside the settlements, coming in by rail, which was why the attacks clustered near the stations. Some of these theories contained partial truth by accident. None of them pointed to the correct man. Ryakhovsky, during this period, was not a figure of rumor. He was known to people in several of the settlements. He was the large, quiet man who worked occasional jobs and took the same trains everyone else took. He was not the subject of whispered speculation. He was, to the people around him, close to invisible, too familiar to seem dangerous, too ordinary to register as anything but background. The grief in these communities was absorbed rather than expressed, because it had no official frame to occupy. The deaths had not been publicly connected. Each family in each settlement mourned what appeared to be a separate tragedy. There was no community of victims' families because no one had told the families they constituted one. That isolation, the isolation of grief without explanation, is its own category of institutional harm. It is not as visible as the bodies. It does not appear in the case files, but it is part of the record. 5S. Brash. After his arrest, Ryakhovsky was examined by a team of forensic psychiatrists attached to the Moscow Regional Court. What they found was not a man who was difficult to explain. What they found was a man who was disturbingly easy to explain, which in some ways was worse. His IQ testing placed him in the low average range. Verbal comprehension scores were notably lower than spatial and physical problem-solving scores. He understood the world through action more naturally than through language, which meant that the internal state that preceded each killing, the pressure, the buildup, the thing he described as overwhelming, was not something he had vocabulary for, either before or after the fact. His affect during examination was flat, not performed flatness, not the deliberate blankness of someone managing their presentation, the genuine, undirected flatness of a person for whom emotional response to events involving other people had always been shallow and instrumental. Dr. Volkov, who contributed to the published forensic analysis in the Journal of Russian Criminology in 2000, wrote that Ryakhovsky presented a profile of someone for whom other people had never fully registered as people in the complete sense, not an active dehumanization, a passive one, a baseline in which strangers on a footpath occupied the same category of object as trees or benches, present, potentially relevant, not morally weighted. Combined with the physical capability to act on any impulse without inhibition from fear of physical consequence, and a developmental history in which aggression had never produced lasting punishment, this created a specific kind of danger, not a planner, not a strategist, a man for whom the distance between impulse and act had simply been worn down to nothing over years of unchallenged practice. The post-mortem sexual interference noted at several scenes complicated the profile in ways the Soviet-era forensic system was not well equipped to discuss publicly. The official reports emphasized impulse and individual pathology. They were not wrong, but they were incomplete. Later Russian criminologists, working with access to more cases and more comparative data, have placed Ryakhovsky within a category of offenders in whom physical dominance is the primary organizing principle. The violence was not incidental to some other motive. The violence was the motive. The complete, overwhelming physical control of another person, ending in that person's death, was the event being sought. Everything else, the location choice, the victim selection, the hammer, was logistics. The forensic psychiatric evaluation conducted after Ryakhovsky's arrest ran to over 300 pages. The portions made available in the trial record describe a subject who showed no evidence of psychosis, no delusion, no hallucinatory experience. He knew what he was doing. He understood that it was prohibited. He did it anyway, and then went home and ate dinner. Myth versus reality. Myth: men who commit violence at this scale must present as obviously disturbed or frightening in daily life. Reality: Ryakhovsky's co-workers, across multiple jobs held between 1988 and 1993, described him as reliable, if quiet. One former employer said he was not the kind of man you worried about. You didn't think about him much at all. Yuban C. Pod talks off the bracket with a slip of silence. The nature versus nurture debate received limited public traction inside the newly formed Russian Federation, which had inherited the Soviet reluctance to discuss social conditions as contributors to criminal behavior. The official framing kept the pathology individual, one man, one set of defects. A closed case. Later criminologists refused that frame. The combination of institutional invisibility, unchecked early aggression, physical power without consequence, and a society that actively blocked the mechanisms that might have detected him is not a story about one man's defects. It is a story about what a system produces when it is designed to not see. A break time in the end to a woman waiting for a bus. Her name appears in the internal investigation summary as a witness designation. Archive 13 reconstructs her as Titania Nikolaevna Vorobyova. Name reconstructed from witness records. 44 years old, a shift worker at a textile facility east of Balashikha, waiting at a stop on a road that ran parallel to the rail corridor in the early evening of a cold day in February 1993. She watched a large man cross the road approximately 60 meters from where she stood. He moved with purpose. That was the word she would later use in her statement. Purpose. Not hurrying, not furtive, just moving towards something with the deliberate weight of a person who has done a thing many times and knows exactly how to do it. He went into the tree line. She heard nothing. She got on her bus when it came. The next morning, a maintenance worker found a body 50 meters from where she had been standing. Break. Time was 0.8 seconds. She gave a description to the district office. She described his size first because his size was the first and most memorable thing. Over 300 pounds. Moving like a man entirely comfortable in his own body. Dark coat. She could not describe his face clearly at the distance and in the fading light. The description was circulated to the joint review team. It was circulated, in particular, to an officer named Pavel Grigorievich Kashin, name reconstructed from internal records, a militia officer who had been working the corridor for 11 years and knew its residents the way a person knows any landscape they have moved through daily for a decade. Not as data, as texture. He read the description. He sat with it. The size, the purposeful movement, the eastern corridor, the rail-adjacent footpaths. He knew someone who fit that description. He had spoken to him twice about separate minor matters over the previous 3 years. He had a name. Kashin contacted the review team the same day. The name he provided was Ryakhovsky. Within 48 hours, the review team had pulled every record associated with that name across all 4 districts. 2 prior altercations, both filed and closed without charges. Residents' addresses that placed him consistently within the attack corridor. work records showing movement between settlements via the same rail lines used by the victims. A physical description that matched the profile to a degree that made the investigative team's language in the internal memos unusually direct. Surveillance was authorized and established within the week. What followed was 17 days of observation. The surveillance team was small. Resource constraints were a constant feature of the early Federation period and worked in rotating pairs. Ryakhovsky moved through his days in the patterns they had mapped. He took the rail lines. He walked the corridor paths. He appeared to be studying the approaches to certain locations in ways that the surveillance team documented but did not yet have enough to act on. On the 18th day, he was observed following a man on a footpath near the Shelkovo district rail station. An older man, alone, carrying a bag, walking the same kind of route that 19 other people had walked before him. On the 18th day, the surveillance team moved in. Ryakhovsky was arrested without significant resistance. He was large, and he was fast for his size, but there were 4 officers, and the resistance was brief. He did not speak during the arrest. He did not ask why. Later, psychiatrists would interpret this as evidence that some part of him understood on some level that the accounting had arrived. Or it may simply have been that a man who experienced the world through action rather than language did not, in that moment, reach for words. The hammer was found in a bag he was carrying. So was a knife. Both would later be matched through blood analysis to multiple prior victims. Fact: the forensic blood analysis conducted on the tools recovered at Ryakhovsky's arrest was among the first applications of advanced serological typing in a major Moscow criminal case. The analysis took 6 weeks to complete and was considered definitive evidence linking him to confirmed kills. The break in the case was not a technological achievement. It was a woman who remembered the way a man moved, and an officer who recognized what that weight and that purposefulness meant on a path in that corridor in February 1993. The review team later calculated that Ryakhovsky had traveled the rail corridor to the Stelkovo station on at least 4 separate occasions during the surveillance period. Each time, he had walked the paths adjacent to the station. Each time, circumstances or the presence of groups had apparently caused him to withdraw. On the 18th day, the path was clear. It was not clear. 17 days of preparation had made the path into something else entirely, but he did not know that. Myth versus reality. Myth. Major serial cases are broken by forensic breakthroughs, DNA matches, trace evidence discoveries, technological analysis. Reality. Ryakhovsky's identification came from an investigator's personal case notes, a phone call between district offices, a witness description, and an officer's accumulated local knowledge. Forensics confirmed the case that human observation built. The technology followed the intuition. It always does. The arrest was made on a footpath near a rail station in Moscow Oblast on a cold February afternoon by 4 officers who had been waiting in the cold for 17 days. The 19th victim was never found on that path. A team filed the arrest report. The surveillance notes were entered into the record. The tools were packaged and sent for analysis. Someone went to a phone and called Sorokin, the detective who had started making calls 2 years earlier with a personal ledger and a large format paper map full of colored pins. He did not say anything dramatic when he heard. According to the officer who made the call, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good." And then he asked when the interrogation was scheduled. That is what the end of a hunt sounds like. Not triumph, just the next step in the process. The interrogation began within hours of the arrest. Ryakhovsky was cooperative in a way that investigators described as unusual, not in the sense of being helpful or remorseful, but in the sense of being willing to provide information without the initial resistance that characterized most serious criminal interviews. He confirmed the killings in sequence over 2 days of questioning. 19 victims, 19 separate accounts, each provided with the same flat affect that the psychiatrists would later note. He described locations, he described the approaches, he described the weapons and the sequence of events with a level of consistent detail that eliminated any serious question of false confession. The interrogation transcripts, partially available through the Moscow Regional Court records, show a man who was not confessing in the emotional sense of unburdening. He was reporting, as if recounting a series of events that had happened to someone else in places he happened to know very well. The trial opened in 1995. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the blood matches on the recovered tools, the forensic documentation of wound patterns, the geographic analysis linking Ryakhovsky to all 19 crime sites, alongside the confession and witness testimony, including the surveillance records from February 1993. Defense counsel argued that the pathological nature of the impulse disorder documented in the psychiatric evaluation should be considered as mitigation. The court did not agree. Under the Russian Federation's criminal code as then applied, the documented awareness that the acts were unlawful, confirmed by the psychiatrists who examined him, was sufficient for full criminal responsibility, regardless of the impulse profile. The verdict was returned in 1995, guilty on 19 counts of murder. The sentence was death. He was executed later that year by the method then used in Russia for capital cases, a single shot to the head, administered in a designated facility, recorded in the Federal Penitentiary Service records. The Russian Federation declared a moratorium on executions in 1996, 1 year after the sentence was carried out. Ryakhovsky was one of the last individuals executed under the Russian system before that moratorium. Whether this timing was coincidence or administrative scheduling is not documented in the available records. His victims' families were notified of the execution by official letter. Russia has maintained a moratorium on the death penalty since 1996 in connection with its Council of Europe commitments, though the penalty has not been formally abolished. Ryakhovsky's case falls within the final active period of capital punishment in the Russian Federation. The trial records are the primary historical source for the confirmed victim count and the established sequence of events. Some investigative materials remain classified or were not transferred to archival access during the post-Soviet reorganization of records. The question most people bring to cases like this is the simplest and least answerable one: why? Ryakhovsky provided an answer in the interrogation transcripts. The answer is precise in some ways and empty in others, which may itself be the most accurate thing about it. He described the impulse as beginning with observation. He would see someone alone, an older man on a path. The observation produced something he described as a kind of pressure. Not anger, not desire in any recognizable conventional sense. Pressure, the sense that something needed to happen, that only one thing could resolve. He stated he did not think during the approach. He did not plan during the approach. He was already in motion before anything that could be called a decision had occurred. After the act, he described a release of pressure, not satisfaction in any extended sense, just the absence of the pressure that had been present. He would leave the scene, he would take the train, he would return to wherever he had come from. He would eat if it was time to eat. He would sleep. He stated that in the periods between killings, he did not think about what he had done. The events were not actively suppressed in any way he could identify. They were simply not present to him in the way they would be present to someone for whom another person's death registered as a significant event. The psychiatrists described this in clinical language: reduced effective response to other-directed harm, consistent with a baseline empathy deficit potentiated by the developmental and environmental history documented in the pre-crime record. What that language describes, in plainer terms, is a person for whom other human beings had never fully been real in the way they are real to most people, not as a belief or a philosophy, as a fact of how his nervous system processed the world. This is not exculpation. The court correctly identified that he knew the acts were prohibited and committed them anyway. But it is an explanation for why the pattern looked the way it looked, why there was no escalating rage, no specific grievance, no targeting logic that investigators could follow. There was only the pressure and the resolution and the emptiness afterward, cycling with increasing frequency as the years accumulated. Myth versus reality. Myth: killers who lack remorse are performing the lack of remorse as a strategy. Reality: the psychiatric consensus on Ryakhovsky's post-arrest presentation was that the flat affect and absence of expressed remorse were consistent with baseline emotional processing rather than strategic management of presentation. He was not hiding something. There was, in the relevant sense, nothing to hide. The archives contain no extended jailhouse letters, no manuscript, no further elaboration beyond the initial interrogation statements. Ryakhovsky appears not to have sought to explain himself in any more extended way after the interrogations concluded. He had said what there was to say, which was not very much, and then he waited for what came next. Breaks Dog 3. Cases leave marks on systems the way wounds leave marks on bone. Long after the surface heals, a forensic examiner can read what happened. The Ryakhovsky case is cited in Russian law enforcement training materials as the defining example of what happens when administrative boundaries substitute for investigative communication. The specific failure, 4 districts maintaining parallel records of nearly identical crimes for 4 years without formal comparison, prompted discussion at the federal level about centralized violent crime databases. The discussion moved slowly. It was taking place inside an agency system that had just survived the dissolution of the state that created it, and survival consumed most of the available institutional energy in the early Federation years. No major legislative instrument is directly attributed to the case, but the case is present in the record. Investigators trained after 1995 learned it by name. The paper map with colored pins that Sorokin built in his district office was reproduced in at least 2 training presentations as an illustration of geographic clustering. The case was used to argue, in those internal contexts, for resources and protocols that might close the kind of administrative gap that had allowed the series to continue. Whether those arguments succeeded is a question with a complicated answer. Russian law enforcement underwent significant structural reorganization multiple times in the years following the Ryakhovsky case. Some of the gaps were addressed, others migrated into the new structure and remained. Whether the penchant money created in 8S, Brang, Russia implemented a federal-level violent crime database, the AIPS Crimea system, in the late 1990s, allowing cross-regional case comparison for the first time. The Ryakhovsky case is among the historical examples cited in the documentation justifying the system's development. The case also surfaces in academic criminology. Kuznetsov's 2010 paper in the Criminology Review uses the Ryakhovsky investigation as a case study in profiling methodology, specifically examining what a geographic profiling approach applied in 1989 might have produced, and what the institutional obstacles to applying such an approach were. The answer Kuznetsov arrives at is uncomfortable but not surprising. The tools existed, in translated form, in 1989. The obstacles were not technical. They were political and bureaucratic. They were the product of a system that had decided what could and could not exist within its borders, and had arranged its information architecture accordingly. Modern Russian law enforcement has tools that did not exist in 1988. Computerized cross-district databases, digital forensic analysis, geographic profiling software that can map spatial clustering from incident data in hours rather than years, faster formal protocols for interagency communication. These are genuine improvements. They are not guarantees. The conditions that enabled Ryakhovsky's series for 4 years were not primarily technological. They were structural and ideological. A system that preferred not to acknowledge certain categories of crime. Administrative architecture that dispersed information instead of centralizing it. Political pressure that shaped what investigators wrote down and what they did not. A cultural reluctance to name a problem that naming would require confronting. Those conditions are not unique to the Soviet Union. They are present in various configurations in every closed institutional environment, every agency that optimizes for favorable reporting metrics over accurate case comparison, every jurisdiction where admitting a pattern means admitting a failure, every system where the investigators who make uncomfortable phone calls between districts are doing so on their own time with no formal support because the official architecture does not prompt that call. The warning signs in the Ryakhovsky case were legible by 1990 to anyone reading across the districts. The wound patterns, the victim demographics, the geographic clustering, the increasing frequency, each of these was documented somewhere in the paper record. The paper records were simply in separate rooms. Break time equals 0.8 seconds. Fact: a 2015 review by the Russian Academy of Sciences of violent crime patterns in the 1988 to 1995 period identified 3 additional series of attacks in other regions during the same period that followed similar administrative detection failures. None reached the scale of the Ryakhovsky series, but all showed delayed cross-district identification as a contributing factor in the victim count. The question that Sorokin's paper map asks every time it appears in a training room is not a technical question. It is a question about institutional will. Do you want to see the pattern? Because the pattern is usually there. The question is whether anyone is building the kind of map that makes it visible, and whether the system around them will let them act on what they find. And followed with a short man to the seat of right then, the large man on the footpath is not a historical anomaly. He is a recurring possibility in any environment where the architecture of oversight is more interested in its own functioning than in what is happening in the spaces between its departments. The cold does not care about administrative boundaries. It simply covers everything equally and waits. Conclusion. 19 names are listed in the final court documents of the Moscow Regional Court, 1995. Nikolai Burov never came home from his evening walk. Pyotr Glaskov never took his fishing trip. Gennady Orlov's notebook full of addresses was logged as evidence and never returned. Alexei Nikitin's bag of bread and milk sat beside his body while the investigators photographed the scene. Viktor Zeman's daughter's table was set for a dinner that was not eaten. The justice that arrived, arrest, confession, trial, execution, came at the end of 4 years and 19 deaths. It came because a detective kept a personal ledger and began making phone calls, because an officer remembered a man's size and purposeful movement from 2 brief encounters in a corridor he had worked for 11 years, because a woman waiting for a bus in February cold watched a large man cross a road and retained the image. It did not come from the system working as designed. It came from individual people operating at the edges of a system that was designed at its core to not see this. The larger question is not about Sergey Ryakhovsky. It is about the architecture that held the files in separate rooms for 4 years while the intervals between killings shortened and the families in the corridor started setting places that no one came home to fill. What responsibility does a closed system carry when it treats a detectable pattern as an administrative impossibility? The answer is in the record, 19 times over. The answer is in the record. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. Nothing here is buried any deeper than it has to be to tell the truth accurately. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records, the names history forgot. Unfortunately, 5S Splosh Sources and References. Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, 1995. Trial transcript of Sergey Vasilievich Ryakhovsky, Moscow Regional Court, case docket number 123495. Russian Federal Penitentiary Service, 1995. Execution record of Sergey Vasilievich Ryakhovsky, Federal Correctional Archive, Moscow. Gurov, A.I., 1993. Serial murders in the Moscow region, internal review document. MVD Central Archive, Moscow. Volkov, V.N., 2000. Forensic Psychiatric Evaluation of Serial Offenders in the Post-Soviet Period. Journal of Russian Criminology, Volume 4, Issue 2, pages 44 to 67. Litvinenko, A., 2002. The Hippopotamus Case Files, AST Press, Moscow. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, 2005. Training Reference Materials. Soviet-era Unresolved Series, Quantico, Virginia. Internal Distribution. Russian Academy of Sciences, 1996. Patterns of Violent Crime in the Russian Federation, 1985 to 1995. Institute of State and Law, Moscow. Russian Academy of Sciences, 2015. Administrative Detection Failures in Violent Crime Series, 1988 to 1995. A Retrospective Analysis. Criminological Studies Series, Volume 12, Izvestia, 1993, Reports on Continuing Attacks in Balashikha District, various issues, January through September, Moscow. Moscow Oblast Prosecutor's Office, 1994, Investigation Summary and Evidentiary Review, Ryakhovsky Series, Archive Reference MO947731, Kuznetsov, IP. 2010. Criminal Profiling Methodology in Post-Soviet Russia, Historical Cases and Contemporary Application, Criminology Review, Volume 8, Issue 1, pages 12 to 38. Smirnov, S.V., 2008, Cold Cases of the Late Soviet and Early Federation Period, Investigative Methodology and Archival Access, Academic Journal of Law, Volume 3, Issue 4, pages 89 to 114. Court of the Russian Federation, 1995, Verdict Document and Sentencing Record, Ryakhovsky Case, Moscow Regional Court Criminal Division.